Now, our first panel is a good one, so I'm glad you're here for this. Please help me welcome U.S. Congressman Darren Soto, George Washington University President Dr. Thomas J. LeBlanc, and George Washington Director and former CNN White House Correspondent and anchor, Frank Sesno. Please. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Well, good morning, everybody. Everything going okay so far?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning,
everyone.
Good. Well, welcome, and we're delighted to have you. Before we get started, we should know our audience a little bit, right? How many are in the world of technology? All right. How many are not from the United States of America? Awesome. How many are not from Florida? Okay, have some sense of things. So it's a great pleasure to be with you here today and for us to generate this conversation about what we call capital connections, how higher education and government can work together to create the progress, partnership, policy around technology. Congressman Darren Soto, you are Florida's 9th, correct?
That's correct.
It encompasses Orlando.
The Central Florida area, yeah.
And your key committee in Congress is?
Energy and Commerce.
And why does that relate to technology?
Well, we govern the whole internet.
You govern the whole internet? Everything?
It's in our jurisdiction.
Wow, that's
now we're interested.
Yes, yes.
You're the first congressman of Puerto Rican descent elected from Florida.
That's
correct. Pretty amazing thing. And you were named by the Speaker of the House as one of only 3 freshman members to the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. What does that mean?
Well, we help decide committee assignments, so I got to help our colleagues down here in South Florida, including Donna Shalala and Debbie Mercasel-Powell, to get to the great committee assignments they had here.
President Tom LeBlanc, you're the 17th president of George Washington University. Your academic background, your experience is in?
Computer science.
And you were here in Miami for a long time.
I was a provost at the University of Miami for 12 years.
Anybody been to the University of Miami? Okay.
All right.
Awesome school. And before that, you had a lot of experience in computer science and engineering. You've done a lot of writing. What is your area of specialty and focus?
Parallel processing.
Which means what?
Using a lot of computers to solve a problem.
Using a lot of computers to solve a problem. Okay, so let's dive into our conversation here. And Congressman Soto, I want to start with you. You are very focused in a lot of your work on the technology side. In fact, you're on the subcommittee on communications and technology. Why? What is your interest in this tech world?
Well, I was embellishing a little bit. The Energy and Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over interstate commerce, so technology, the internet, commerce in general, we work on a lot of those issues. One, the higher paying jobs is a big issue in Florida, in Central Florida and South Florida and other areas, so it is a great opportunity to be a job creator. But 2, I saw that there is a lack of initiative for members of Congress to get and work in this technology space. And look no further than the hearings with Mark Zuckerberg last term. Those are pretty cringeworthy and embarrassing. I think a lot of people
Because people didn't know what they were talking about?
People know what they were talking about. So I got home that night and my wife was like, nobody knows blank in Congress about technology.
Stop there, maybe.
Yes, and because, you know, being young enough to use a lot of the applications and being around for the personal computer and cell phones and all this stuff, which a lot of my peers, that was much later in their life, it looked like a great opportunity to really go into this area, and obviously we've been pretty prolific in working in there.
Is anybody in the room involved in any way, shape, or form in artificial intelligence, AI? Anybody interested in it and know it's coming down the road? Okay, so you have this thing called the AI Jobs Act, that you've introduced, right? And you're working on this bill. What is that and why is that?
Well, the background is when the internet was developed in the 90s and beyond, we saw it create all these jobs, but it was also very disruptive. And our government was not prepared and caught flat-footed in not giving folks whose industries were disrupted the skills they need to go into the new economy. We're trying to do a better job now with artificial intelligence. We must and be bullish on a lot of these tech issues like AI. It's going to be
a lot of doom and gloom out there around.
Well, no, I think we've always done well with technology and kept our dominance in the world as the most powerful democracy and to lead in freedom. But the key is we need to be better prepared for the disruption. So the AI Jobs Act, one, identifies areas where we could do more investment in artificial intelligence. Two, identifies industries that would be disrupted. And then three, helps with skills training for workers who may be displaced as a result of artificial intelligence, really getting in front of it.
Do we know what industries are going to be most disruptive now?
So we have an idea. Obviously, transportation we're seeing with, you'll see driverless cars at some point. Some manufacturing, even some medical services will be taken over by artificial intelligence, but there'll also be other areas in technology. And I have a district where we have the busiest spaceport in the world, so we're going to see more and more of commercial space and the what I like to call the extraterrestrial economy. So there's going to be lots of new jobs in the future in technology, but in the meantime, we have to retrain folks so that they don't get caught where they're unemployable and then they can't provide for their families.
And my understanding is this AI Jobs Act also would engage a government-sanctioned research to try to dig into some of these questions where we don't know what's coming down the pike, right?
Sure.
So what do you feel we most need to understand going forward?
Where the applications will be helpful. First of all, think big data, whether it's healthcare, whether it's tackling climate change, whether it's manufacturing and distributing worldwide. There are any giant problem that is beyond a few humans' comprehension. These are where supercomputers and AI are going to be a huge help. And we see that already on the internet and in social media, where you have ads pop up based upon preferences that you may have. All that we're seeing going forward is based upon artificial intelligence and big data.
There's lots more that we'll talk about on the policy side, cryptocurrency, blockchain, and some other things. But I want to bring President LeBlanc in here because as you talk about the research that's needed, as you talk about these questions that are unknown, that seems to be part of what you're steering towards and part of this government higher education partnership. So talk about your priorities here and how you see the university playing into these needs that we've just heard about.
Well, George Washington is located right in Foggy Bottom, and we have really close connections.
That'd be in Washington, D.C.
We have really close connections with all parts of government, and a lot of students come to George Washington to be a part of that. And I asked the question over and over, as you just described it, how come no one knew what to ask Mark Zuckerberg when he was testifying? And it's because I think we've taken technology and put it over here, and we've taken policy, law, politics, and put it over here, and there's not enough overlap. So one of the things I'd like to do is take advantage of our historic strengths in media and policy and law and merge them with expertise in technology to start to bridge that divide. And if our students are doing that, it will work its way into the halls of government.
I should have said that you are also an alum of George Washington University,
That's
right?
correct.
Law
GW
school.
Law, 2004.
So how do you see, knowing both what GW is, where it is, and sort of the higher education brief generally, and these challenges that you're talking about, this connection that can be most beneficial?
Well, first, the federal government, no big secret, works with a lot of universities, including GW, and there's competitive grants on everything you can imagine, from cybersecurity to national defense to developing new artificial intelligence. So a lot of the research is done in cooperation and partnerships with universities and the National Science Foundation or National Institute of Health. The other area is through a lot of the research being done on policy. For instance, there's a lot of new journals and articles out there about the role of internet privacy and whether there should be a duty of care and how we should own our information online and how to govern. I mean, so I found a lot of academic treatises to be very helpful as I'm navigating and trying to work this out with our committee.
There's a lot going on at GW where faculty are drilling down into this area. What are some of the examples that you might give where the research is connecting with people, community, the planet, to really be out in front and lead this discussion?
It may be a consequence of our location, but we're being driven by the problems that we're seeing.
Driven by the problems that we're
Driven by the problems that we're seeing. So let me give you one example. We have a faculty member who's crowdsourcing photography of hotel rooms to find the source of where child pornography is being produced. And it turns out every hotel room looks the same, but if you're actually doing some A on the photographs, there are little differences.
And we should point out that this is not randomly taking pictures of your hotel rooms, but what's happening in some of this trafficking is people will post pictures, sometimes pornographic pictures, but law enforcement can now use this technology to scan and identify where this hotel room is.
And we've got faculty looking at bias in deep learning, which is more and more a real problem.
What is that?
Let me give you a simple example. A lot of deep learning is doing language translation. And when you translate between languages with and without gendered pronouns, what comes out in the end in English is always he. And that's a simple example of where it's natural for the deep learning algorithms, which you have to be trained. It depends on the data set. There's a lot of feedback involved to produce implicit bias in the outcomes. So we've got a faculty member who's looking at that. If you move up from kind of the impact on the individual and start to think about community, we're working with the District of Columbia that is gathering tons of data, all aspects of what's going on in the district, but they don't have an analytics arm. And so not really able to use the data in some deep way yet. And we're hoping to become the data analytics arm of the District of Columbia.
The data analytics arm of the District of Columbia. So if you're partnering with a city like that, and I know other universities around the country are doing similar sorts of things, what does that have the university doing that it's not doing now? What does that let the district do that it isn't doing now?
Well, first of all, it gives us access to all the data. And all of this depends on having access to the data. And the district just doesn't have the manpower, they don't have the infrastructure to do the data analytics. So one of the problems the district is worried about is a perception that there's some hate crime growth activity within the district. And by analyzing the frequency, incidences, where exactly they're taking place and so on, we may be able to predict and ultimately figure out what's driving some of the hate crimes.
Congressman, you want to talk about this cryptocurrency blockchain interest you've got?
Sure. As we know, there's a huge rise in cryptocurrency, and that being an increasing amount of the internet transactions. But there's no laws on the subject really, other than agency interpretations of what cryptocurrency is and the regulations and how what disclosures have to be made. So we put out bipartisan legislation about 2 weeks ago with Congressman Warren Davidson to establish the jurisdiction of the SEC, of the CFTC and the FTC, as well as the definitions of when it can be a currency, when it's a security, and when it will be a future or a commodity. And one of the keys is to make sure we make sure that the jurisdiction for SEC is tightly wound, because that can be a lot of disclosures, and a lot of the cryptocurrency market isn't securities. And because of this uncertainty, right now we have cryptocurrency startups going to other countries because half their capital is going to legal right now because of the uncertainty. So without going too into heavy regulation, we're just establishing the definitions, establishing the jurisdiction, and allowing a lot of these firms to grow. And I'll tell you why that's important. Right now, the dollar is the dominant currency in the world, and that has a role in our standing in the world. But at some point soon, it's going to be these cryptocurrencies that are involved in a lot of the transactions. And so if we don't get ahead of this, we could see other countries that tend to not believe in the freedom and equality that we have dominating the space. So it's absolutely critical that we are well positioned for the future of these economic
transactions. It's an issue of security and competitiveness and all the rest. President Bond?
I have the advantage, since I live on campus, I often stumble onto things. And one Saturday morning, I stumbled onto a blockchain hackathon. And there was a whole group of students there. And the first thing I noted was they weren't all the classic engineering geeks. First of all, about a third to a half.
Not that there's anything wrong with classic
Not
engineering.
there's anything wrong with that. A third to a half of them were women. And I went up to the first group that was working on a project, and I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're inventing a new internet."
Inventing a new internet.
And I said, "Guys, it's a 24-hour hackathon." And they said, "It's okay, it's just a prototype." I went to the next group and I said, "What are you working on?" And they said, "We're inventing a new business system of banking." The next group, "What are you working on?" "We're inventing a new way to do real estate transactions." The point is, on a Saturday morning, we have a ton of 18 to 22-year-olds, not all engineers, who view blockchain as a way of organizing future societies. So we can talk about regulating its current use for money and so on, But there is a whole new world that is being imagined. And if we don't start to be a part of that conversation, help lead that conversation, both at the political level and obviously at the university level, then that's a whole area that we won't be prepared for when that comes down either.
I mean, we are literally inventing the future here as we're talking about this. I know that one of the areas that you also focus on, that you're also concerned about, is diversity in technology. What is your observation? What is the status right now? Because this is another place, obviously, where universities are dealing with this future generation, this pipeline of talent. But what do we see in what's out there now, and how concerned are you about it?
Well, the tech industry is not very diverse. 81% of the industry are Anglo males, and we know the talent out there is much broader and much diverser than that. But the key is that we have to start that pipeline early. So
how do you do that? What are you trying to do from a policy level?
So we're working on a bill with Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman of New Jersey to encourage through grants more schools to bring in and encourage more women and minorities to get into tech early and encourage companies to be more diverse. We look at the talent that could be sliding by us. Just the other day, a 29-year-old female grad student was the first one to photograph a black hole. And a lot of you may have heard about that, and at first she wasn't given the proper credit for it. And we're seeing as a husband of a math and science teacher, former math and science teacher, we know how critical and how important it is to have our girls start getting more involved in this, because then that helps with the AI bias and technology bias that we see. I'll give you a perfect example with sensors. A lot of them have trouble recognizing darker skin in communities of color. So these are things that when you have more diversity in a lot of these firms, they think about earlier. And
a lot of these firms are not very diverse right now.
And so we're encouraging it, but it starts by getting at the talent pipeline early as middle school to high school. We're seeing that in Central Florida with the Space Coast and with the virtual reality and simulation training that we're doing, but broader overall, we're going to be continuing to push upon both universities, our K through 12 system, and a lot of these technology firms to become more diverse, and we're going to incentivize it to happen.
So talk about how you do that and how you balance that against both the legal restrictions and some of the pushback that we're now seeing culturally. How do you, as a university president in the capital of the United States of America, provide this more diverse pipeline?
Well, one of the things we're seeing at every university level is the changing demographics of the applicant pool.
So it's just coming at you.
It is coming at you, both in terms of gender and color. It's often referred to as the browning of America. We're seeing more what have historically been called underrepresented minorities going into the college system, and more women than men are applying to college now. They tend to be more successful in high school, mature earlier. So the demographics coming in are constantly increasing. Part of the challenge in some of these engineering fields is the culture they run into tends to be very discouraging.
Because it's an entrenched white male culture?
It's an entrenched white male culture, and then it gets entrenched in the deep learning algorithms, and it gets reflected back. And so there's not a lot of ways in which these new entrants to the field feel included in what's going on. So we have an engineering school that is nearly 50% women. Now, to be fair, biomedical engineering is a very strong and hot growing field, and it tends to attract more women. But when you have a school and the culture of a school that's more welcoming of women, I think that it will eventually impact some of the other disciplines within engineering. And the same thing's true with underrepresented minorities.
And I just want to put in perspective, so the tech sector, we all know, we have thousands of people here today because the growth is astronomical, and there's a need for more programmers and folks with these backgrounds. So this isn't like a take away from one, give the other kind of scenario. We literally don't have enough people going into these fields, and so creating that greater opportunity actually will lead to more growth for everybody to be able to have jobs in these areas. And so I think that's a key point. Like, this is going to be a larger and larger share of the economy. And so if we don't have the diversity there, we will be less competitive because we will continue to have AI bias, we'll continue to have issues where we don't understand how a technology would apply to other cultures, and that will limit growth ultimately. There's plenty of jobs for everybody, but we need to have more folks from the talent pipeline of middle school and high school onward to get into these fields to really be able to make sure we don't inhibit our future growth in the tech space.
The zeitgeist has really flipped on the internet and social media, right? A few years ago, this was this brave new world. It was going to be inclusive. It was going to create democracy at every level of our culture. And we've seen over the last several years a very dramatic change in what actually can happen, the dark side of that cloud, and the pushback that's happened as a result. Europe leads the way with much more regulation than we've got in this country. Mark Zuckerberg has basically said, yes, we need regulation, but what he's actually talking about is very much up in the air. Where's the balance? How do you see the balance between a more regulatory environment to protect our privacy, our security, and all the rest, and the space we need to allow the innovation that's going to be invented at universities and elsewhere to take place in this uniquely American marketplace?
So we're looking to the states for several models. For instance, we like in the committee Delaware's model on making these explanations and disclosures conspicuous and in plain language. We like some of the California model, but believe it goes a little too far. For instance, we like the fact that the California model allows you to own your own information. I believe Americans believe they own it, but there's no law either way. However, the big difference is in the California model, if you denied a company to be able to use your information, then you can still have that service for free. And that's where I think a lot of the members of Congress, we sort of deviate from that big point. So if you're going to tell Facebook, we don't want you to use my information anymore, then they'd at least be able to charge a fee for their service or for others. But I think I had a town hall the other day and I asked two questions. One was, how many people think it's scary that all this information is being used? Everybody raised their hand. How many people are surprised? No one raised their hand. So I think we all get a sense of it, but there's got to be we can't wreck whole business models and profit models for a lot of these companies through this privacy process.
One of the areas where we've been working together actually is in this world of disinformation, and we're working on setting up an institute that would dig into that. Again, we come to the university's role to kind of figure out what's going on.
So when I was at the University of Miami, when they asked me what kept me up at night, I said I was afraid a student was going to get hit crossing the road, US 1. 45 miles an hour, our students weren't careful, and it had happened multiple times. When I was asked the same question at GW, streets are a little more calm, speed limit's lower. I'm scared to death one of my students is going to get run over by technology, social media in particular.
What do you mean?
We've had a number of incidences where students did something foolish and they were convinced their life was over. It got magnified way out of proportion to an 18-year-old mistake.
Through social media.
Through social media, which then gets picked up by other media. And then all of a sudden, I actually had an undergraduate who had to apologize publicly for a post she made when she was 13 years old.
When she was 13 years old?
Yes, and it resurfaced when she was 20, and her explanation was, I've grown since then. To which my response was, I certainly hope so. So there are a lot of ways in which this technology can be harmful at the individual level. Now, the work that we're doing together is the ways in which it can be harmful at the global level. And this new institute on data, disinformation, and democracy is tackling what I think everybody now agrees is a huge problem. But this is a huge problem that grew on our radar screen in the last 2 or 3 years. And it just tells us how quickly everything is moving. Something we weren't really sensitive to 3 years ago is now viewed as a huge problem. And I think it's the kind of problem universities have to tackle. We need to be the kind of unbiased intermediary that goes in there and says, how is this working? What's actually happening? Here's some of the facts. And it's pretty exciting because we're sitting in a media capital of the world where this is a huge problem, and we're bringing together our historic strengths in law, policy, international relations, and our emerging strengths in technology to tackle that problem through this new institute.
Yeah, one of the interesting things for me as a former journalist is to see how we were the gatekeepers to information, right? And we actually had certain standards. Is there a source, anonymous or otherwise? Is it verified? Are there multiple sources? If it's wrong, do we correct it? In the world of social media, in the world of disinformation, there's none of that. And there are bots and there are deep fakes and all these other things that are fundamentally confusing people. This is an epidemic, and it seems to me the university is a place where we can bring together the research, the policymakers, the media, and others. This is just one example to try to find the solutions. This is a question to both of you. You know, if we think about Stanford University, for example, and the role that it plays in Silicon Valley, it is a generator of ideas. It is a generator of companies and innovations. Turn to Washington, D.C., and a partnership in Washington. Washington is where politics happens, so there's a lot of arguing, but there's also where policy is made. You're a university in Washington. So what is that government higher ed connection there that's sort of our version of the Stanford kind of thing? What is the opportunity?
Well, first of all, I think Washington is evolving, and the public view of that is Amazon's new headquarters. But the reality is 70% of the world's internet traffic passes within a half a mile of our Virginia campus.
70% of the world's internet?
Manny Medina, who started eMerge, had a data center out there. It's the place where there are huge numbers of data centers. So Washington has always had technology. It's always been on the Beltway and sort of outside the Beltway and not necessarily talked about inside the Beltway. And what we're trying to do is bring those two worlds together by having students who are intimately connected with the political system, whether they're interning, eventually running for Congress, running for local office, and so on, who are learning how to use technology. And I think that's a critical role for us. My view is every single student needs to have access to the skill set for the quantitative analysis of data using technology. Whatever they're studying, they have to have that. And we want to be a university that provides that so that when they go out and intern at the World Bank or Congress or the Supreme Court or wherever it is, they're bringing that skill set and that awareness with them.
What's your take on that?
So I believe our universities are our talent and idea factories for the federal government, particularly those well situated like GW, right in the heart of DC. I can tell you, I was preparing at first to be a general practitioner in Florida. Never had any idea at that time I was going to run for office, but everything from the intellectual property survey course I took to international law to environmental law, I found it preparing me to be a legislator and having to vote on just about everything you can imagine. I think people forget about that in Congress. We have to vote on just about everything you could imagine and have some expertise on it. So from my personal point of view, it was key to have a strong background that GW Law gave me, but also we have interns and we have others coming up through the ranks. A lot of my peers went to work at the agencies or clerked at the Supreme Court. So it really gives you that opportunity to be able to go to these profound federal institutions and bring those ideas and education that they learned at GW or other local universities.
It's also a safe space. Universities, even when they're under attack sometimes, which happens, are still in a very, very polarized time. This is still where our young people go to study. It's still where research gets done. And in Washington, it seems to me, which is so divided right now, there's an opportunity to convene thought, research, practice that others can't do.
Well, we have a unique opportunity in that we can walk to all these offices and they can walk to us. And so we've had every aspect of the political spectrum on campus, whether they're making a presentation, participating in a panel, whatever it might be. My first month as president, we had 1,000 intelligence agents from around the world on campus. And if you remember the 60s and 70s, that would have provoked a riot. We had a bunch of students lined up for internships with those agencies. Now, at the same time, we had the Secretary of Education come and do a panel, and we actually had 10 students protest that appearance, all very peacefully. And it was just a part of the discussion that takes place in Washington. And we do need to be the conveners because the discourse has gotten so coarse and difficult, the willingness to listen to other sides. And I think our largest student group is the Young Democrats, and our second largest student group is the Young Republicans. So we have active politics, but we've tried to maintain a polite convening space on campus.
I work with them both, and we co-host events with them to actually model the kind of civil discourse that we're looking for. We're almost done here. Let me ask you both to kind of look ahead. It's 5 years from now. It's 7 years from now. and we're doing things, or we've anticipated things differently. What would you like from one another? Where do you think this partnership can be most productive, addressing some of the challenges that we've talked about this morning, whether it's diversity, disinformation threats, changes to the job market? Look down the line and tell us where we're going.
Well, I think the key for our universities is not to prepare for the jobs for the next 5 to 10 years, but for the next 20 to 30 years. Some of that's critical thinking. Some of that is the basics of computer programming and understanding technology policy, which is really in its infancy right now. But I think that's key, as well as a lot of these papers that professors are putting out on everything from privacy to AI to cryptocurrency to international trade and how intellectual property is being navigated through there. So being what we need you all to continue to be, which is idea factories and have that talent pipeline, are absolutely critical. But prepare your students for the idea that they have no idea what job they're going to have 20, 30 years from now, because it may not have even been invented yet. Because they could be working in space, they could be working a mile below ground, they could be working totally from home doing artificial intelligence, so the possibilities are endless.
Well, I love that answer, in part because universities are often under enormous pressure to produce students for the job that is today. So whenever I go to these economic forums, they cite how many cybersecurity positions are open, and they say, we need you to train 50,000 people in cybersecurity. But it's cybersecurity as it's defined today for today's challenges, and that's not really what universities ought to be doing. So I do believe we ought to be looking to the future. One of the things that we're trying to do is bring communities of thought together that don't often get together. And the example we're talking about were students who do media, but they're also interested in climate change. And how can you use your skill in media to really explain what's going on with climate change? Similarly, students who are interested in politics in the past wouldn't have any real encounters with technology, but now they have to. And so bringing those things together in a place like DC that helps inform the community around us, that's I think what our university can do, and other universities can be doing as well.
Okay, before we go, you each get a 10-second plug. You get to plug your podcast.
Sure, Rockin' Politics. It's on Anchor and on my social media.
As in rock music?
As in rock music combined with different topics, everything from immigration to working on technology to just the latest things we're dealing with on voting rights. So look us up online, Rockin' Politics, on my social media page, Darren Soto, on Facebook, Darren Soto.
You get to plug your booth outside.
Visit the George Washington University booth right out here with Sixtera. We've got some fabulous examples of our faculty research, and you'll get to participate in a cybersecurity attack and be in the Situation Room in the White House and see how you would respond. So please stop by and see it.
So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking a president and a congressman for a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.